There are still some people out there who doubt that the United States is waging a new Cold War on China. Now, to those people, my response is, look at what's going on in the U.S. Congress. U.S. Congress members are losing their minds trying to outcompete each other to see who can be more hawkish against China, to see who hates China the most. And in fact, this September, the U.S. House of Representatives boasted that it passed 25 bills in 1 week that were all anti-China. 25 laws in 1 week that aim at trying to weaken China, trying to destabilize the Communist Party and eventually overthrow it, that threaten many more sanctions on China, that threaten export controls on China, that put Chinese companies on a blacklist so they cannot do trade with the US, that also threaten Hong Kong and potentially could push for war in Taiwan. These bills will also restrict any interchange between people in the US and China. It would effectively ban any joint scientific research. It will also basically ban China from teaching about Chinese culture and teaching the Chinese language in US universities. These laws will also pressure and even force other countries to join the US in its new Cold War on China. I mean, when you take all of these bills together, it becomes very clear that in Washington, among both Republicans and Democrats, because these bills were supported by the vast majority of the House of Representatives from both parties, when you look at all of this together, you can see that this is a new Cold War. And a huge part of this new Cold War is the propaganda war, the information war. And one of these bills passed by the U.S. House of Representatives would allot $1.6 billion to fund anti-China propaganda around the world. This legislation passed with a massive majority of 351 votes to 36, and it would allot $1.6 billion for the State Department and USAID, which is a CIA cutout, over 5 years to subsidize media and civil society groups, that is, political organizations, to demonize China around the world, to brainwash people to hate China, and to organize to eventually destabilize and ultimately try to overthrow the Communist Party of China. Because that's Washington's goal. It's to do to China what the US did to the Soviet Union in 1991 at the end of the First Cold War, with the overthrow of the Soviet Union and then the installation of a puppet like Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s, who oversaw the mass pillaging, the looting of Russia, the mass privatization of state-owned enterprises that were sold off for pennies on the dollar to capitalist oligarchs, not only in Russia, but also in the West. There were oligarchs who got wealthy from pillaging the country, privatizing its resources. And meanwhile, the U.S. puppet Boris Yeltsin was an alcoholic who was just drunk all the time and just signing whatever the U.S. government put on his desk. This is what Washington would like to see happen to China, and it's investing a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of energy in trying to do so. By the way, the U.S. House of Representatives has an entire committee dedicated exclusively to trying to destabilize China, which is the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, and they proudly referred to this as China Week, the week in which they passed 24 pieces of legislation trying to destabilize China. So instead of spending money on trying to help the people of the United States, trying to make their lives better, providing healthcare and education and childcare and transportation and infrastructure, no. The Congress is not concerned with that. The U.S. government isn't concerned with that. They want war. They want to brainwash people around the world to hate China, to hate Russia. They want to boost the stocks of the military contractors in the military-industrial complex who fund them. And by the way, considering that insider trading is rampant in the U.S. Congress, and representatives from both the Republican and Democratic Party make millions and millions of dollars investing in these companies that fund them, they profit as well. So instead of actually caring for the people of the United States and providing them the social services that they need, We can see that in the US Congress, politicians are only focused on waging more and more war, interfering in foreign countries' affairs, destabilizing foreign countries, and trying in vain to maintain the imperial chokehold of the US empire over the entire world. In fact, the Financial Times published an article in 2023 that I think summarizes quite well the warmongering attitude in Washington. Now, this article was written by the Financial Times columnist Gideon Rachman, who is a British centrist. He's not in any way sympathetic to China. He's not an anti-war activist. He's a total centrist. But when he took a trip to Washington, this British columnist was actually shocked at how bloodthirsty US politicians are from both parties. He said, visiting Washington last week, it was striking how commonplace talk of war between the US and China has become. He said, many influential people seem to think that a US-China war is not only possible, but probable. Of course, publicly, US officials claim that they're not waging a new Cold War. Of course, we know that US politicians lie all the time, as we saw in the lead up to the Iraq War, when we were told that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
Saddam Hussein's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, in my view, is one of those clear dangers. In my judgment, President Bush is right to be concerned about Saddam Hussein's relentless pursuit of weapons of mass destruction.
But today, their argument is that they don't want a new Cold War. Instead, US President Joe Biden and people in his administration claim that they only want competition, that it's a geopolitical rivalry, but it's not a new Cold War. But we all know that's just rhetoric. And if you look past the superficial rhetoric, you can see that in terms of the tangible policies that the US government is taking, they're very similar to the policies that Washington carried out against the former Soviet Union in the first Cold War. And of course, at the center of those policies is the strategy of containment. And in a historic speech in 2022, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken essentially announced a new containment policy against China. In his words, Washington's goal is to shape the strategic environment around Beijing, which is a fancy way of saying containment.
We cannot rely on Beijing to change its trajectory. So, we will shape the strategic environment around Beijing to advance our vision for an open, inclusive international system. The scale and the scope of the challenge posed by the People's Republic of China will test American diplomacy like nothing we've seen before. Even as President Putin's war continues, we will remain focused on the most serious long-term challenge to the international order, and that's posed by the People's Republic of China. China is the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and, increasingly, the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do it.
Now, why is Washington so afraid of Beijing? Well, in this speech, Antony Blinken also acknowledged that the reason they see China as such a big threat is because it's the only country on earth that is powerful enough to not only challenge, but to actually change the US-dominated global order. In this speech, he constantly said the rules-based order, the rules-based international order, the liberal international order. When US officials say that, they mean the US-controlled order. They mean after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, in which the US basically dominated the entire world in a unipolar order in which the US makes the rules and orders everyone around, US officials see China as a threat because it's the only country powerful enough to transform the global order and prevent the US from being a global dictator that controls the politics and the economic policies of countries everywhere. Now, what was striking about that speech that Antony Blinken, the Democrat, gave in 2022 is how similar it was to the speech given by the Republican Secretary of State Mike Pompeo under Donald Trump back in 2020. Mike Pompeo was not only Donald Trump's Secretary of State, but also previously he had been the CIA director under Trump. And he famously said in the CIA, he taught people how to lie, cheat, and steal.
What's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
Well, later, as head of the State Department that is overseeing U.S. foreign policy in the Trump administration, in 2020, Pompeo gave a historic speech at the Richard Nixon Library in which he basically called for overthrowing the Chinese government. He portrayed the Communist Party of China as the biggest threat to freedom-loving people around the world. He openly called for changing China. And when he says change, that means regime change. It means overthrowing the Chinese government. And again, what was so fascinating about this speech is that, Pompeo is a hard right Republican and Blinken is a liberal Democrat. And yet they basically agree. Their speeches were very similar when it comes to China, demonizing China's socialist system, demonizing the Communist Party of China, portraying China as evil because it doesn't allow corporations to control Chinese society, because the Chinese government controls capital instead of allowing capitalists to control the government. And also in both speeches, Pompeo and Blinken constantly talked about the so-called rules-based order, which again is an attempt by the US to replace the international law-based order centered in the UN with a US-controlled order in which Washington makes the rules and orders everyone around. Here are a few clips from the speech from Pompeo, this neoconservative Republican, and you can hear how similar he sounds to the liberal interventionist Blinken in the Biden administration. And you can really see here how this is completely bipartisan. The hatred, the obsession with trying to regime change China is completely bipartisan in Washington.
We, the freedom-loving nations of the world, must induce China to change, just as President Nixon wanted. We must induce China to change in more creative and assertive ways because Beijing's actions threaten our people and our prosperity. We can't treat this incarnation of China as a normal country just like any other. And if we don't act now, ultimately, the CCP will erode our freedoms and subvert the rules-based order that our societies have worked so hard to build. If we bend the knee now, our children's children may be at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party, whose actions are the primary challenge today in the free world. Securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time, and America is perfectly positioned to lead it.
Now, it's not just the State Department that's threatening China, but also the Central Intelligence Agency. I did a previous report, which I will link to in the description below, looking at an article that was written by the CIA director, William Burns, in which he portrayed China as the biggest threat to the United States. The CIA director wrote, quote, "While Russia may pose the most immediate challenge, China is the bigger long-term threat," end quote. So he's saying that in the short term, Moscow is a so-called threat to US hegemony, but in the long term, Beijing is the biggest threat. And in response to that, he said, quote, "The CIA has been reorganizing itself to reflect that priority," end quote. He revealed that, quote, "The CIA has committed substantially more resources toward China-related intelligence collection, operations, and analysis around the world, more than doubling the percentage of our overall budget focused on China over just the last 2 years," end quote. And he also pointed out that in 2021, the CIA set up a mission center focused exclusively on China, and it is the only mission center that is focused on one country. So the CIA has said our top priority is destabilizing China. We of course know that the CIA is not only a spy agency. They don't only collect intelligence. He also said operations. And when he says operations, that means assassinations, regime change, destabilization, spreading fake news and disinformation, just trying to destabilize the governments of foreign adversaries, trying to overthrow their governments to install a US puppet regime. That's what the CIA has done in dozens of countries, going back famously to the CIA-orchestrated coup in Iran against Iran's democratically elected prime minister in 1953, or the CIA coup against Guatemala's democratically elected president in 1954, or the CIA orchestrated coup against Chile's democratically elected president in 1973. There are so many other examples throughout history. And today, the CIA is threatening China very publicly in this article published in Foreign Affairs magazine, saying, China is our number one threat. We've doubled our budget to try to destabilize it. So this brings me back to the 25 pieces of legislation that were passed in just 1 week by the US House of Representatives, which are all aimed at trying to destabilize China. NBC News published an article on this so-called China Week that has a very appropriate title, quote, "It was tough on China Week in Congress, one of the few issues both parties agree on." It noted that many of the measures, the 25 pieces of legislation, passed with bipartisan support, and it noted that this geopolitical rivalry, the new Cold War on China, quote, "is one of the few issues both Republicans and Democrats can agree on," end quote. So, as always, war is what brings US politicians together, trying to interfere in the internal affairs of foreign countries to try to destabilize and overthrow their governments, violating their sovereignty, waging economic war against them, information war. This is bipartisan in Washington. Of course, bombing those countries as well is completely bipartisan, largely because the same weapons corporations in the military-industrial complex fund the politicians, the lawmakers, from both the Republican and Democratic parties, who are the ones voting on these bills that will then push for the new Cold War on China. So in the rest of my analysis today, I want to briefly summarize the legislation that was passed by the US House of Representatives, and it shows how obsessed the US government is with trying to destabilize China and destroy any competition to US corporate monopolies. Now, all of these bills that I'll be looking at come from the website congress.gov, where you can see them all for yourself. I've already addressed one of them, which is the Countering the PRC Malign Influence Fund Authorization Act. This is the legislation that will give $1.6 billion to the US State Department and the CIA cut out USAID in order to spread anti-China propaganda around the world. Now, in addition to that, there was also the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office Certification Act. What this bill threatens to do is to take away permission from the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices to operate in the United States. So this is basically a way of threatening to cut off trade between Hong Kong and the US. And of course, Hong Kong is part of China, and it was colonized by the British Empire in 1841. But in 1997, it finally was reincorporated into China after a century and a half of British colonialism. And ever since, the US has been trying to destabilize the Hong Kong government, trying to install puppets through a color revolution attempt to try to use Hong Kong as a base of operations to destabilize mainland China. And of course, Washington has also been using Taiwan to do the same, despite the fact that in the 1970s, when the US officially normalized relations with the People's Republic of China, the US signed 3 communiques that acknowledged that Taiwan is part of China. There's only one China, and Taiwan is part of it. However, ever since the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, when the same year when the US officially normalized relations with China, ever since, the US has been supporting separatist extremists on Taiwan to try to destabilize the government, to declare independence, to try to wage a war on mainland China. And there's this hilariously named act that was passed by the House, which is called the Taiwan Conflict Deterrence Act, which, as with so many policies in the US, is actually the exact opposite of what it claims to be. It should be called the Taiwan Conflict Encouragement Act, because that's the goal, is to encourage conflict. What this legislation would do is make it even easier to sanction top Chinese government officials and to sanction their family members in the name of, quote, deterring Chinese aggression towards Taiwan, end quote. So Once again, it's the exact opposite of what they claim. They're actually making war over Taiwan more likely by not only threatening top Chinese government officials, but also threatening their family members. But in reality, if we look at some of the other pieces of legislation passed by the House of Representatives, we can see that they're very clearly preparing for a potential war with China, including the so-called Pacific Partnership Act. This bill calls for the U.S. to strengthen its alliances in the Pacific region, of course, preparing for a potential war with China. And in the same vein, the House passed another bill, which is called Recognizing the Importance of Trilateral Cooperation among the United States, Japan, and South Korea. This is very straightforward. It calls for greater strategic coordination among the US, Japan, and South Korea, again, to prepare for a war on China. Many of the other bills passed by the House of Representatives also constitute acts of economic war and call for more and more sanctions on China. One of such pieces of legislation is the Economic Espionage Prevention Act. This makes it even easier for the US government to impose sanctions on foreign companies and entities that are accused of so-called espionage, which of course we know that the US accuses everyone it doesn't like of so-called espionage. Well, in reality, the NSA, the US National Security Agency, is spying on people all around the world. And what's interesting about this legislation is it not only targets China, but it also targets other so-called foreign adversaries. So if a company or an organization or individual is accused by the US of providing material support or services to a foreign adversary's national security entities, they will be sanctioned. And who are those foreign adversaries? They're named China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and the so-called Maduro regime of Venezuela. So they even refuse to recognize the legitimate, internationally recognized government of Venezuela. But what this legislation is saying is that if the US government accuses any individual or entity or company linked to any of those countries and claims that they constitute national security threats, the US can impose sanctions on them. Now, a lot of these bills are pretty redundant because a lot of them simply just make it easier to impose more sanctions. This is true of another bill that was passed, which is the Export Control Enforcement and Enhancement Act. This legislation would basically allow other US government agencies to expand the sanctions list, which is called officially the entity list. And what it would do is it would allow other departments like the Department of State, Defense, and Energy, or other federal agencies to make proposals to the Department of Commerce, which oversees the sanctions list. So again, this makes it much easier for anyone in the US government to try to expand the number of sanctions the US has on countries around the world. And as I explained in a recent report, which I will link to in the description below, the US is already waging economic war around the world. In fact, 1/3 of all countries on Earth are under US sanctions. 1/3, including 60% of poor countries. So now the US Congress is threatening to continue expanding sanctions, making it easier and easier for Washington to wage economic war everywhere. In fact, what's kind of funny is that the US has so many sanctions. It has over 15,000 sanctions on entities around the world that it has actually become very complicated for different US government agencies to deal with these sanctions. So the Congress passed another bill as part of these 25 anti-China bills, which is called the Sanctions List Harmonization Act. What this would do is it would require different US government agencies, including the Departments of Treasury, Commerce, and Defense, to notify each other when they place a foreign individual or entity on a sanctions list. Because these sanctions lists have become so long that the US government is now trying to simplify its economic war on the world. And speaking of economic war, many of the bills that were passed by the US Congress in China Week are dedicated at trying to sabotage specific industries in China to prevent Chinese companies from competing with US tech monopolies. And one of these is the End Chinese Dominance of Electric Vehicles in America Act, which would basically make it impossible, almost impossible, for Chinese companies to export electric vehicles to the United States. Now, Joe Biden himself already imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, so this is pretty redundant. But what's so hilarious about this paranoia in Washington is that there are very few Chinese EVs in the US. Oh, I mean, it's laughable how few they are. Even the New York Times had to admit this in an article that was titled, "Few Chinese electric cars are sold in US, but industry fears a flood." So they're afraid of something that hasn't even happened. In April 2024, just 1 month before the Biden White House imposed tariffs on Chinese EVs, the U.S. International Trade Commission published a report on Chinese vehicle exports. In this document, the U.S. International Trade Commission admitted that between 2018 and 2023, Chinese EV imports were only 2% of total US EV imports. I repeat, 2%, single digits. But US corporate monopolies are so afraid of competition from China, and the politicians in Washington who are funded by those US corporate monopolies are so afraid that after Biden put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, the US House of Representatives had to pass another piece of legislation, the End Chinese Dominance of Electric Vehicles in America Act, just to try to make it even harder for China to export EVs. And again, this title, the End Chinese Dominance of Electric Vehicles in America, there is no Chinese dominance. It's 2% of EV imports in the US. It's laughable. But of course, it's not just electric vehicles. These US corporate monopolies don't want any competition from Chinese companies, and that's why the politicians they fund in Congress also passed other bills that try to prevent Chinese companies from competing. One of these pieces of legislation is called the Countering CCP Drones Act. What this bill would do is restrict purchases in the US of drones produced by the world's leading drone producer, DJI Technologies, which is, of course, a Chinese company based in Shenzhen. And the US Congress refers to this Chinese company and its drones as a, quote, unacceptable risk to US national security, end quote. So one of the bills targeted Chinese EVs, another targeted Chinese drones. A third bill was passed that is called Decoupling from Foreign Adversarial Battery Dependence Act. This legislation would essentially restrict the US government from buying battery technology that is produced by Chinese companies. So again, they're protecting US corporate monopolies from competition from China, and they're targeting Chinese EVs, Chinese drones, and Chinese batteries. Which, by the way, is also redundant because the Biden White House already imposed 25% tariffs on Chinese batteries, which will make them much more expensive and therefore less competitive. So continuing with these bills passed by Congress during the China Week, the Congress also, the House of Representatives also passed the Biosecure Act, which would restrict companies in the US and entities, different organizations, from working with Chinese biotech companies. So again, targeting Chinese EVs, Chinese drones, Chinese batteries, and now Chinese biotech companies. Yet another piece of legislation called the Routers Act is similar. This legislation would require the US to conduct a study of the national security risks posed by consumer routers and modems produced by companies or individuals that are linked to China, Iran, North Korea, or Russia. So they're essentially saying, we don't want any competition in the production of routers and modems from companies from China, Russia, Iran, or North Korea. Now, as I said earlier, this legislation passed by the House is not only focused on domestic US politics and China, but also the rest of the world. And one of these pieces of legislation, called the Securing Global Telecommunications Act, calls for the US government to expand its policies to other countries. This bill calls for, quote, a strategy to promote the use of secure telecommunication infrastructure in countries other than the United States, end quote. And they insist it must be an industry-led process, which means US corporations. So what they're really saying here is they want the US government to pressure other countries around the world to boycott Chinese products from companies like Huawei, and instead only buy products produced by US companies or by companies from US allies. And meanwhile, as part of the US economic war on China, the House of Representatives passed another bill, which is called the Chinese Currency Accountability Act. This legislation tries to prevent the internationalization of the Chinese currency, the renminbi, also known as the yuan. And it's basically trying to threaten other countries and prevent them from using yuan. And in particular, it requires the US government to oppose any increase in the weight of the Chinese currency in the basket of currencies used by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, in the special drawing rights, the SDRs. So this is basically ordering the US government to order the IMF, which is essentially controlled by the US government, to prevent China from having any more influence in the IMF, which would only further turn the IMF into a tool of the US government. So this shows how the US economic war on China targets many different sectors, not only Chinese industries, but also the Chinese currency itself. Now I'm getting to the end here. There are only a few more pieces of legislation that were passed, but it might seem endless because, again, there were 25 passed in 1 week. Another one of these bills is called the Protecting American Agriculture from Foreign Adversaries Act. What this legislation would do is restrict the purchase of land in the US by people from China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran. So you can't buy land. Another bill passed, the Foreign Adversary Communications Transparency Act, would target media outlets that are from not only China, but also Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea. So this is a way of trying to restrict foreign media outlets in the US. So much for freedom of the press or freedom of speech. Then there is the Science and Technology Agreement Enhanced Congressional Notification Act, which would make it very difficult, basically trying to prohibit any kind of scientific technological exchange between the US and China. So this is trying to prevent researchers from working together on joint projects between the US and China. In a similar vein, the House also passed a bill that would further restrictions on the Confucius Institute, which is a Chinese government-backed educational organization, which is focused on teaching people around the world the Chinese language and also about Chinese culture. Once again, this legislation is pretty redundant, as with so many other pieces, because in reality, as the US Government Accountability Office reported in 2023, nearly all Confucius Institutes in the US have already been closed. So this is mostly a formality. But what's ironic about this, by the way, is that now that the US has closed, the US government has pressured universities across the country to close these Confucius Institutes, there's actually a huge lack now of Chinese language study because the US is trying to scare everyone and threaten everyone. And why would a student study Chinese? Why would a student go to China to study? Because they're going to be threatened by the US government. So while the US is waging this new Cold War against China, at the same time, it has a chronic shortage of Chinese language teachers and people who actually understand Chinese, which you could say is actually the intended impact because they don't want people in the US to be able to communicate with people in China. They're restricting access to any Chinese technologies like TikTok, trying to ban them. They don't want people in the US to meet people in China, to humanize people in China, to have Chinese friends. So that makes it easier to manufacture consent for war on China. And it also means that there's this self-reinforcing feedback loop. You just have all these yes men in the US government. No one actually understands China. They don't speak Chinese. They know nothing about Chinese history or politics or culture because they haven't been educated in any way. So all you have is this confirmation bias and momentum that keeps pushing harder and harder for war. And that really is the intended impact of what the US Congress is doing. Pushing for war on China is manufacturing consent for war on China. That's why the House of Representatives held the so-called China Week, in which they passed 25 bills in 1 week, all trying to demonize and destabilize China. They're preparing for war. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I wish that weren't true. I wish I could sound more optimistic, but I'm being realistic. Warmongering politicians in Washington from both the Republican and Democratic parties are preparing for war in China. And it's a very unfortunate reality, but it's something that we talk about a lot here. We warn about a lot here at Geopolitical Economy Report. So if you want to actually educate yourself and you don't want to be propagandized by the US government, which is now planning to spend $1.6 billion spreading anti-China propaganda overseas, well, there are, fortunately, a few alternatives. That's why I founded Geopolitical Economy Report as an independent media outlet. If you like the work that we do, please like and subscribe. Please share this, follow our reporting. And if you really like the work that we do, please consider supporting us. We are completely independent. We have no institutional support. We have no big donors. We rely entirely on small donations from viewers and listeners and readers like you. So you can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support, and there are several ways to donate. The best is you can go to patreon.com/geopoliticaleconomy and become a patron, help to sustain our work. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I'm Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I will see you all next time.